Well, hello everyone. So this video, we are taking a look at one very underrated 35mm film camera. That is the Ricoh XR-10. I think it's also called some other names like the KR-10, the KR-10 Super, whatever it's called. But Ricoh has rebranded this camera with many different names and sold in many budget discount stores like Sears as such. I don't understand why there are not a lot of information about this camera. However, I just got this camera and I looked through the features of this camera and played around with it for a little bit. And I think this camera is just as capable as any other I would say Minolta's or Canon's mid-tier film cameras, manual focus film cameras in the 70s or 80s. And actually this camera had some of the very cool features not found on many other cameras of that time. Okay, so we're gonna take an overview of this camera and then you guys can make a decision if you see this camera for sale somewhere, whether you should buy it or not for your particular needs. So the camera, when I got it, it came with Rikenon P f2.0 50mm prime lens. So this is a standard lens. And from the look of the coating, it seems to be single coated, but that shouldn't deter you from buying this camera because the coating only had a small impact on the contrast of the image. It doesn't have anything to do with much airs, especially if you're shooting film. Okay, so fairly fast lens. Usually cameras of the slightly higher end would come with f1.7 or f1.8 lens, and some really high-end cameras would come with 50mm f1.4. So f2 is slightly slower, but don't let that deter you from buying this camera because f2 is still a very fast aperture. And the lens from this camera is actually fully plastic. And another telltale that this lens back then was probably targeting a lower end user market. And the construction of the camera, it came out in the early 80s. So again, in the early 80s, plastic started taking over in the film industry, and all those good, beautiful looking cameras from the 70s where it's full metal are all gone. So in the 80s, it's very hard to find a good quality camera that's made of full metal. But so this camera is no exception. It's made of fully plastic. The film backdoor, okay, so it's a very thin piece of rolled steel, okay? And this basic shell inside it's still metal. So the camera is not terribly light, but it's still fairly light. Okay, so but the cover, the top and the bottom are all plastic. The viewfinder, I think it had a coverage of 93% of the field of the view. It's very nice and bright, to be honest, so I don't really have any complaints about the viewfinder. And it's got a full LED display on the right side of the window. Pretty cool display, very informative. And you have an indicator of current shutter speed and some LED warnings on the top and the bottom. Okay, so pretty cool. On the bottom, you can see this camera actually featured a full aperture readout window, which is quite rare on lower end cameras. And so basically what it does is there is a little mirror there that reflects the image to the top, and when you view it, it shows up at the bottom of the prism. Pretty cool. And again, not usually found on this, this tier of affordable cameras, which is really nice. The XR-10 is powered by two LR44 button cell batteries, very common battery. You can find them everywhere nowadays, and they're super cheap. But they work best with silver oxide battery, which is 1.55 volt, which is slightly more expensive, but not as expensive as some other rare kind of batteries. Okay, so you can get a pack of silver oxide, like 10 pack for like $6, and they usually last you at least half a year to a year, depending on how many rolls of film you go through. But nowadays, I don't think anybody shoots that many rolls of film, so they should last you a pretty long time. Now let's get to the juicy part of the review, which is all the features that this supposedly budget-in camera is gonna offer you. So for anybody that just starting out in film photography, if you're a beginner, if you're an absolute beginner, you don't know what you're doing, this camera is gonna be great for you because it features a mode that's called Aperture Priority, which is a mode where all you have to do is set your aperture to control your depth of field during the shooting, and the camera will take care of the rest of the functions for you, which is changing the shutter speed. So the only thing you have to do is change the aperture. You have a larger aperture of f2, you're gonna get a really beautiful blurred background. As you get to the smaller or larger numbers, you get a smaller aperture, which is gonna give you more depth of field. So you can get a sharper image overall. So that's all you have to do for film beginners. Aperture Priority, okay, which is the one of the mode that's featured in this camera. The L indicates off, so indicates off button. So when you put it in L, the shutter doesn't release, even if you call the film advance lever. And if you put to Aperture Priority, depending on the aperture you set, the camera is gonna do a exposure and it's gonna flip up the mirror. As you can see, the aperture moved smaller because I set to a smaller aperture and it took a picture. But again, we don't have any films loaded, so I'm just demonstrating this for you. If you're interested in this camera and you have any questions, feel free to ask me in the comment section below. I'd be happy to answer for you. So Aperture Priority, again, a great feature for film photography beginners. But if you're a film photography beginner and you want to learn everything about film photography, the aperture control, the shutter speed, the relationship between those, overexposure, underexposure, what kind of picture you're gonna get, this camera offers a full manual shutter speed dial. So the shutter speed goes all the way from 16 seconds, which is pretty long exposure time, back in 70s, 80s standards, all the way up to 1,000th of a second. And this is actually a very generous amount of shutter speed control that they give you on this entry-level camera. So another cool thing about this camera, or the shutter, is that it's got a fairly modern metal horizontally traveling shutter that also gets you 125th of a second flash speed sync. So you can use flash on all those numbers below 125th of a second, which is fairly good of a flash sync speed. You can pair it with one of those Ricoh 260p speedlight flash, which is their back then mid-range flash that supports automatic flash metering as well as TTL flash metering. However, the TTL metering in this flash is not supported by this camera, as evident on the missing pin on the other side. But what you do get is the flash ready signal. This little pin here is to give you the flash ready signal when you look through the viewfinder. Once the flash is fully charged, you know when it's safe to fire the shutter. So I'm gonna try to illustrate this for you guys. Let's see if it works. So right now, there is no flash ready light, and we're gonna turn on the flash. See that little red light? That blinks, means it just did a measurement and it took a picture. And so that's really useful if you use flash a lot for your film photography. And this flashlight is more than capable of doing some really, or is pretty capable of reaching some really far distance based on this meter chart. So if you use automatic mode and you set your ISO, all you have to do is figure out your distance that's optimized for this flash to do automatic exposure, and you're good to go. Again, the TTL on this flash does not apply to this camera. Unfortunately, it applies to the XR single digit, the XR-10, I believe. That's what this flash is, actually built for. Very useful shutter speed selection. Very useful flash ready indicator light if you do flash photography. And on the other side, again, very useful feature, which is a exposure compensation dial. This dial, you don't find it much on lower end budget cameras. And I'm surprised that Ricoh actually implemented a full +2, -2 speed, 1/3 increment exposure compensation dial into this camera, the XR-10. Quite useful if you're photographing a scene, that's backlit and you want to properly illuminate your subject. And if it's horribly backlit, you can use, +2 to do so. Or if you're shooting snow, use +2. It's gonna give your snow a nice, proper white exposure. And if you're shooting some black subjects, like maybe a black flash, you can use -1 to 2. So the flashlight doesn't go overexposed, the flash itself doesn't go overexposed and show a grayish color. Very, very useful feature, okay? So for film photography. I'm surprised that they implemented this into the XR-10. Over here, a very easy to read, the ISO dial. All you have to do, lift this little indicator knob and just turn it to the film speed of the film that you currently have. So for example, I'm shooting ISO 400, so I lift it and I set it to ISO 400 and all done. I don't have to worry about my ISO. Quite nice. And we're gonna take a look at the back door or the underside of the camera. And I just put brand new light seals in the camera, so it's, super nice and super ready to shoot a new roll of film. Inside here again, you can see that metal shutter. It's a modern shutter. Should be fairly reliable and long-lasting. The viewfinder again, I can't remember if I mentioned it, 93% coverage, very, very bright, very, very easy to use. In terms of focusing aid, the viewfinder, it's got a split focusing aid. That split screen is actually a cross of 45-degree split, as you can see over here. So how you focus is you align that little two images. Once they're aligned, they're focused. But obviously this one doesn't align because the distance between me and this is too close. But it focuses to about 0.6 meters or 2 feet and a little bit, less. So not the best close focus lens you can get. Usually some other lens that's 50 millimeters would probably go just a little bit closer, but not for this one. But anyway, regardless, it's a great camera in terms of feature. Not only that, features a full electronically controlled self-timer. So if I cock the shutter and I set my shutter speed, aperture is ready, and I hit this button, the self-timer activates, gives you a little red LED indicator light, and it's about 10 seconds. Once the light expires, it takes a picture. Pretty cool. It doesn't lift the mirror though, so you don't have a mirror lockup function, but it does have a self-timer for taking pictures of yourself and your loved ones together. Not only that, another very, very nice, very, very cool, very, very useful feature that this camera features, which is again not found in many other cameras, is a auto exposure lock. Again, extremely important feature for a lot of professional shooters. The auto exposure lock is implemented by pressing this button. When you have an aperture, when you have a reading red in the viewfinder, show you guys again. You press that little button. Well, okay, so it doesn't apply to manual mode. I forgot I'm steering manual mode because, again, that exposure lock is to lock the shutter speed. So it applies to automatic modes only. So in automatic mode, again, I'm going to show you guys where the camera is going to give you a optimized shutter speed based on the reading that you get. So over here it's telling me, okay, I should shoot at 1/8 of a second. And again, it's in orange zoom, so that means it's a little bit low light and it might create a blurry image. So they give you a red light to indicate and warn you that it might be shaky and your picture might not be crisply sharp, which is, again, a nice feature. So again, I'm gonna show you guys the auto exposure lock. You press that button, it flashes. Once that is flashing, you can move your camera away and point at your actual composition area, and wherever you point to, it's gonna lock that shutter speed, and you hit your exposure and it exposes for the correctly metered area, which again is a very, very useful and handy tool. Great for proper exposing your subjects in tricky lighting situations. And I'm very surprised that this XR-10, this entry-level camera, actually featured that function, which is this little button right here. Not only that, it also featured a flash sync right here, a PC sync. So you can use this in studio with strobe lights or some older flashes that doesn't have a hot shoe connection. So you have a lot of, advanced features built into this budget camera. And not only that, it doesn't stop there. This camera actually is able to be paired with a motor drive for auto rewinding and continuous shooting, I believe. So the motor drive contacts are all here, some pins to connect, things that they need, and a motor drive mechanism to connect right here, okay? So this is really cool and a really feature-rich entry-level camera that not many people are talking about. And I did a review of the Minolta X570 and the Minolta X700, which was Minolta's top-of-the-line manual focus film camera back then. This camera actually had every single feature of the X570, as well as the X700. Well, it doesn't have the X700's program exposure mode, but everything, this camera is actually just like the X570. So the X570 nowadays is selling for around, with the lens, around $170 to $200. You can get this camera for less than $25 if you're lucky, okay? In local used market stores, you might be lucky, you might be able to find this camera, and they are not popular, okay? So you should be able to get this camera for a very good price, and they're electronically controlled. So in general, they're fairly reliable compared to some manual focus cameras where, due to age, they might become less reliable and requires adjustments of the shutter and some other things. So the example here I have Olympus OM1. This is absolute classic of the manual focus camera, smallest SLR manual focus camera you can find on the market. It's not cheap. This, with a fairly modern, fairly new lens, multi-coated lens, sells for around $175 up to $250 depending on the condition of the OM1 and depending on the model of the OM1. But looking at this camera, this is a premium camera compared to the XR-10, which is fully plastic, and every knob on here is plastic. But honestly, this plastic design doesn't look bad at all. It actually retains some of the good 80s ergonomic designs using plastic parts. Like, for example, this grip, it looks fantastic. And we didn't talk about this little button here. This is to activate or wake up the meter. If the meter went to sleep mode after about 8 minutes, you can press this and activate the meter in the camera. And it starts to meter again and gives you constant reading from the manual modes in here. To prevent accidental exposure, you put it on lock button and just turn the camera off in general. And if it's on lock, the meter is turned off automatically as well. And I don't think you can press this button. This button is also disabled. So it activates after meter is turned off, okay? So again, a lot of useful functions. You got a auto exposure log, fantastic function for a entry-level camera. You got a meter activation button, and this is a lens release button. You press this and you rotate counterclockwise, you release the lens. Inside chamber looks nice and clean, you know, fairly general design or standard traditional design. And you got a full aperture readout right here. You got a full shutter speed readout in the viewfinder. I can't believe this camera. I cannot believe I did not discover this camera earlier. Okay, like it's really, really useful. Like all the features built in, it's designed to be used. It's designed to be enjoyed by any photographer that was lucky enough to get this camera. And I feel like this camera is so underrated because I didn't saw much useful review of this particular camera on YouTube. Maybe one guy, he was comparing this with the top end of the Ricoh, and that was a different model. That was the KR-10 something that he was comparing to. This is XR-10. The XR-10 has a auto exposure log, which I believe the other one that he compared to does not. So this camera is actually a newer model. It's a later model. It's fully electric. It's manual exposure and auto exposure all combined. It's cheap. It's plastic. All the knobs are plastic. All the letters are printed on, so they might wear off if you use it quite a lot. So just be aware of that. Compared to some other cameras where all the letters are etched, engraved one way or the other, so they don't ever fade, okay? And so is the on-off switch right here. And again, I love my Olympus OM, but I'm surprised that this camera is able to offer such a good value for such little money. The one last thing I forgot to talk about is the lens mount. It uses Pentax K mount, which gives you an option of lots of fantastic Pentax Super multi-coated SMC lenses that you can use. And Pentax K lens design haven't changed much, so you can use quite a lot of options. And they actually have some modern options from Samyang and Rikenon, like fast primes that you can choose. That's Pentax K mount possible. So you have options to use some really good optics using the XR-10. And again, to me, lenses are actually more important than the camera body. But this is a really good starting point for anybody interested in film photography and is on a limited budget. Check out the Ricoh XR series of the cameras. Again, be mindful of some of the features that I talked about, which I think is important, which is the aperture priority auto exposure and the ability to see the full readout of the shutter speed and the aperture in the viewfinder. Okay, those are some of the important features that you want in a camera that is going to serve you, make photography experience faster. So, and exposure compensation dial and a self-timer. There are just a lot of features to talk about in this camera. But that's pretty much it. If you guys have any other questions in regards to the Ricoh XR-10 that I reviewed, feel free to ask me in the comment section down below, and I'll be happy to answer those questions for you guys. And again, I hope you found this video helpful. If you did, please do hit the like button or subscribe to my channel, and I'll see you in the next video. Thanks again, and take care.